with my next question, I'd like to go back to the question of green extraction. So, you're a strategic co-director of the Climate and Community Institute, and in that role, you co-authored a recent report which is titled "More Mobility, Less Mining," which explores different decarbonization scenarios. So the report finds that lithium demand could actually be reduced by up to 92% in 2050, compared to the most lithium-intensive projections. And doing this primarily by reducing car dependency, right-sizing EV batteries, and establishing a strong recycling system. Also, you've described yourself as agnostic on one of the key divides within the climate left, so between ecomodernism and degrowth. So I wonder how does this report navigate the tension between, on the one hand, criticizing extraction and on the other hand, advocating for maybe more controlled approach to it. So to put it polemically, do you think there's a sort of eco-socialist model of extraction that is possible?
Yeah, thanks. I like the polemical question. So I think that there's a couple of ways that I would analyze this debate about eco-modernism and degrowth, or I won't not analyze the debate, but sort of my position in it or outside of it, or as the case may be. I think on the one hand, to some degree, the wrong questions are being asked. And one of the questions that tends to be asked by these two different camps, especially about what I work on, which is this energy transition related extraction, is like, is there enough? Right? And so it's a question of like sort of planetary boundaries or underlying resources. And the strong eco-modernist view is that the possibilities are limitless. Whether that's because there's a sense that, we keep discovering more resources, more deposits, I mean, or whether that's because of a belief in decoupling, whether absolute or relative, meaning that you can sort of decouple growth from its ecological requirements or from its ecological impacts or its climate emissions, right? So through efficiencies of production, through technological innovation, you actually reduce the impacts of capitalism, right? That's another way in which eco-modernism is optimistic about the kind of resource question. We'll just need less per unit over time because we'll innovate our way out of this question. Degrowth is way less sanguine. It's much more pessimistic about whether the planet can actually support this level of growth that's currently or forecast, right? And sometimes, not always, and so I want to be clear here because there are degrowth analyses that are very similar to mine and some that are less similar to mine, right? And so what I actually say I'm agnostic on is not per se my position in this debate. I think I'm closer to the degrowth side, but whether degrowth is the right kind of concept or term. And the reason is because I think, there's sort of different versions of degrowth, but there is a version that has been prominent where the claim is a strong one about kind of relatively static or written in stone, as it were, planetary boundaries, and that there simply are not enough resources to sustain a sort of Western mode of lifestyle or production or consumption, especially if that's kind of universalized around the planet, right? And so, when I say they ask the wrong question, I think the question of like, is there enough, is actually not really ever what governs what happens with extraction, nor is it what is most concerning about extraction. So from the degrowth perspective, it's less that I'm worried that we're going to run out of lithium, which we're not about to anytime soon. And it's more that I'm worried about the mounting ecological toll of extracting it. And so I think that view can align with degrowth, but it's maybe sometimes issues from a slightly different concern. But maybe also to push and to stay with the polemics. I think that to different degrees, degrowth scholars and activists have an answer or don't to the question of, well, how do we extract under eco-socialism or in a utopian degrowth, commune that we live in, right? Like, if we could implement degrowth, if we could, and in its most progressive and left-wing version, where we're attentive to class, we're attentive to geographic differences, right? Where we're not saying that we should impose austerity on Bolivia. Like, we're saying, no, the austerity is actually just for the ruling classes and the global north, like they should consume less. Like, I think there are versions of degrowth that are so similar to my politics because they're very attuned to class differences in consumption or geographic differences in consumption, right? But, even with that nuance that I think the best versions of degrowth bring to the table, which is like not like this universal austerity for everybody, we still have this question of like, if we implemented an eco-socialist society, which had things like free and frequent and reliable electric buses that served working class communities and got them around and created no tailpipe emissions and were just lovely kind of like specimens of communal luxury, right? Like that kind of world, where do the batteries come from? Like who makes them and where does the lithium come from, right? Like these are questions that I think the best degrowth scholars do answer, but not always everyone in degrowth, right? And because there is an almost uncomfortability or a sort of lack of comfort, I don't know if that's a word, a lack of comfort with dealing with this fundamental fact of extraction. And so, you know, I think what I press on my comrades, I'll put it that way, like, because in a political kind of sense, like, and people that I've organized with, campaigned with, done all this, is like, how do we deal with the fact that even under eco-socialism, there is a metabolism with nature, and that some of that metabolism with nature involves the appropriation of non-renewable resources, right? Because there's one kind of metabolic version where you're kind of in a constantly renewing, right? But if we look at things like lithium or any minerals or metals, like they are not renewable on human timescales. So is there a way that we're like, you know, how do we extract those so that we can make the e-buses, but without falling into the worst pitfalls? And I think that of the harms of extraction and the inequalities of it. And I think, you know, one thing that I want to say, which your question points us to, is that I think it's important to keep conceptual daylight between extractivism as this like kind of brutal, violent, extractive modality of capitalism in the world's peripheries, whether those peripheries are in the global south or internal to the global north, right? That extractivism as a system, from extraction as an economic activity that we can, I think, imagine under a fundamentally different economic system, governed by totally different imperatives, whether those are imperatives of planning, democratic planning, eco-social planning, whether those are kind of parameters of worker ownership or community ownership, whether the idea is that the people who extract should benefit from the extraction. So those e-buses are not only also made near the mine site, but the communities around the factory and the mine also ride the e-buses and maybe own the e-bus, you know, or maybe it's a public company, right? I mean, this thought experiment is just to point us to the fact that once we start teasing out the distinction between extraction like simpliciter and extractivism as a certain way that extraction has taken place for half a millennia under capitalism, I think we can get pretty granular and think of some quite interesting possibilities of how extraction could be quite different under eco-socialism, including, perhaps most importantly, that there could be a lot less of it. Not none of it in the near term, because we need to build the e-buses, right? They don't exist, there are not enough of them yet. But over time, it can become more circular, but at the very least, without this privatized and unequal consumption patterns, we could extract much less. And I think that should be itself a goal of eco-socialist extraction, is to minimize its size in the economy or in the social framework in which it occurs.